the shoes of Samir Rahim to run the Prospect Prospect Book Club for this evening, and especially delighted to be joined by Amelia Gentleman, who's just produced this absolutely wonderful book documenting some of the most important journalism that's been done in the last 10 years on the Windrush scandal, which she for a long time single-handedly was effectively bringing to light. It's a book that's about individual lives, about public policy, and about the history not only of Britain's West Indians, but of course also the history of all of us in how we did and didn't welcome those people. Amelia I know well from The Guardian, where we worked together in the past, and in recent months she's also written about the sort of public policy side of the Windrush scandal for Prospect. Now Amelia, about 18 months ago, I guess it is now, this was the biggest story in the country. It brought down a Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, and for a time it looked like it was endangering a Prime Minister too. And it's a story that you eventually dedicated months of your life to, and hard reporting, all of which is in here. But it's also a story which at the very beginning you kind of chanced upon, isn't it? Because you were away on holiday and gave the first case to someone else, and so it came back to you.
Yeah, so the first I heard of it was an email from a charity based in Wolverhampton who sent an email of the sort that, you know, in a way we all get dozens of every week. So it was a request from a small charity to look at an individual's case that they felt really required some media attention. And these emails are always really hard to know how to respond to, because on the one hand, you want to write about people's lives. On the other hand, it's often very difficult to focus on one person and say anything particularly meaningful about what's happening more broadly. But anyway, this email was unlike most, because in the subject field it said urgent attention needed, a lady who's been in Britain for 50 years is being deported. And so on that on that sentence alone, it seemed like it was a story worth looking at. This was a woman called Paulette Wilson, who had arrived in Britain, I think in 1968, at the age of about 10. She'd come from Jamaica to join her grandparents, who were working in the UK. Had lived in the UK ever since, went to primary school, secondary school here, had worked all her life, and had been told as she approached retirement age that she was an illegal immigrant. So she'd had a letter from the Home Office telling her that she was liable for detention and deportation. She, it emerged later, had spent almost 2 years trying to persuade Home Office officials that they'd made a mistake, but no one listened to her, and eventually she was arrested twice. The second time taken to Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre, which, as you know, is a kind of notorious immigration detention centre just for women. And at the end of a week there, she was taken to Heathrow, where she was about to be put on a plane back to Jamaica, a country she'd left half a century before and hadn't visited in the meantime. But luckily she was given a reprieve because her MP got involved. So the charity that week, when she'd been in detention, had emailed me asking if we could do something. And I was on half term, trying not to look at my emails, looking after my children. And
you'd done something with the charity before?
Oh yeah. I'd been there a couple of years before to Wolverhampton, because interestingly, it was in the constituency that Enoch Powell fought in, that Enoch Powell represented. And I'd been sent there by the news desk in 2015 because it was a marginal seat that could have gone either way. And I went to write a piece about immigration there, and I'd met this charity.
So that's why they tapped you up?
That's why they emailed me. So it was an extraordinary kind of random way of coming to me. I sent the email onto the news desk and asked if they could get somebody else to look at it. Somebody did look at it. By the time, though, she was in touch with the charity, Paulette had been released, and so a story didn't get written. But when I came back to work, I just thought it was really a strange thing for the Home Office to have done, to detain somebody for a week in a detention centre, somebody who was a grandmother, hadn't broken the law in any way, and somebody who'd worked at the House of Commons for a while as a catering assistant. It just seemed a really kind of, even on a kind of public spending point of view, it just seemed a really odd thing to have done, because to detain somebody for a week kind of for no reason felt pretty peculiar. So I went to interview her. And we published a story in The Guardian. We had a really beautiful picture of her, which I think is kind of significant as part of the reporting that we did. A, in that she was brave enough to agree to have her picture in the paper, and B, in that it helped our readers to understand that this was a real person, not just an anonymous, an anonymised case study. We published quite a long piece in The Guardian about 2 years ago, a bit over 2 years ago. And the response from our readers was instantaneous. We got dozens, or hundreds of emails saying that people offering to help her, people offering to help with financial support for legal help, people offering to pay immigration fees, and people just kind of generally saying how ashamed they felt of the treatment that she'd had. There was no political response to that piece, and I hadn't really been able to get much explanation from the Home Office at that point about why it had happened. But the other thing that came in almost immediately after publication was phone calls from other people who had been similarly affected. And I think on the morning that the piece was in the paper, I had a call from a man who said I should go and interview his father, who had been in immigration detention for 5 weeks and who had also been booked earlier that week on a plane back to Jamaica. He hadn't had to go in the end, but he had also arrived in the UK at the age of 9, I think, and had lived here for the past 50 years, had also never broken the law, and was struggling to understand why he'd been detained and told he was an illegal immigrant. So, yeah.
So the news begets more news quite quickly.
Yeah. Although it was quite difficult for the first few months of reporting to understand why this was happening, and also to persuade people who were affected that they wanted to talk about it publicly, because the kind of stigma around immigration is so high that if you've been told by the Home Office that you're an illegal immigrant, you don't necessarily want to have your picture in the paper underneath a headline that tells everybody that that's your how you've been branded. And a lot of people who I interviewed hadn't even told their family that they were going through this, because there was because people were frightened and felt ashamed, wrongly.
And another communication challenge you talk about is trying to persuade the without wanting to knock anyone's colleagues, but the sort of jaded mindset that creeps on people who are running the backbench at a kind of newspaper, because there's always another bloody awful thing that's going on. There's always a bad news story back then about immigration, the people coming across from Syria and so on. But what you as you pulled the cases together found is that it was a very specific problem of this generation of people. You tell us the dates from between independence, is it, and the 70s?
So it's people who arrived in the UK from Commonwealth countries, usually as children, between 1948 and 1973, when the law changed, who were in later life told that they were illegal immigrants. And that's quite a convoluted explanation, and it was very difficult initially to explain to my editors why this was interesting, because it's a very kind of dry scenario, and it was very difficult to explain that in the crucial first paragraph of an article, and it absolutely was impossible to put that in a headline. So to begin with,
you needed it almost in every story you were running.
You needed to explain that, and it was only after some months that a campaigner pointed out that these people were descendants of the people who arrived in 1948 on the Empire Windrush, and that it was coming up for the 70th anniversary of the arrival of that ship. And that campaigner began to refer to these people as the Windrush generation. And that was an incredibly, initially useful sort of branding that made people immediately understand which group of people we were talking about, and also made people kind of relate to them as part of our immigration history. But to begin with, it absolutely was very hard for me to go to the news editors and say, this is another story of somebody who arrived at the age of, as a child in the 1950s or 60s, who is now reaching retirement age, who's got this very specific immigration problem. Just too complicated.
So it's a reminder that those kind of headlines matter. You know, before we could get to the Windrush Betrayal, someone had to come up with that name. Why is it, do you think, it was also, as well as being quite specific in date terms, it was quite specific, it seems, to West Indian people rather than, say, India, Pakistan, or lots of British colonies in Africa? That didn't seem to be part of it in the same way.
Yeah. So there is quite a bit of kind of immigration history that I have to quickly explain in as quickly as I can, which is that in 1948 there was a very liberal, on the face of it, bit of immigration law, and I feel apologetic if there's anybody in the room who is totally an immigration law expert, because I don't want to kind of simplify it too much, but there was the principle of free movement for everybody who was in the Commonwealth or everybody who was living in a colony, UK colony, in 1948. This was established as a principle before it was cheap to travel. So the politics of it was that this should be allowed, that anybody who was living in the colony was a citizen of the United Kingdom and British colonies, and should have the freedom to come and live in the UK, the mother country, should they want to. Some years later, it became a lot cheaper to come from all over the world to the UK, and the numbers of people immigrating to the UK suddenly started to rise into the tens of thousands, and this very familiar debate about kind of migration levels began in the early 1950s about how much is too much, when do we need to introduce controls. And over the decades, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, new restrictions on that 1948 Act were introduced. And by 1973, that principle of free movement was broadly ended. It was people who arrived before 1973 from the colonies came here legally. They didn't have to do anything to register their arrival, or to they didn't have to become a British citizen, and the Home Office wasn't keeping any lists of those people who come. at that time it didn't really matter. It only became problematic later, really in 2012, when we began to require people to prove that they were here legally at a time when there was kind of this pressure to cut net migration figures. And the reason why more people from the Caribbean have got caught up in this is kind of, it's not 100% clear, but I think it's to do with when countries became independent.
And that was later than, say, India.
Yeah, so when people were moving from India to the UK, they were already Indian citizens. And so when they came to the UK, although they were able to come here, they would have been much more aware of their immigration status. Whereas if you came to the UK from Jamaica, before Jamaica became independent in 1962, the passport that you had was almost identical to the passport that you would have been issued with in London, and looks very much like the passport which we may or may not be getting again after Brexit. So it's that same black passport, and it says citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies. It's a CUKC passport. So if you come from Jamaica at that time, before 1962, you were freely landed, and you were making essentially an internal journey. You would get a stamp in your passport saying that you were here, you had indefinite leave to remain, but you wouldn't, I mean, you could become a British citizen, and you would if you wanted to travel abroad, or if you wanted, if you got a British passport, that helped things. But part of the problem is, I think, that a lot of the people who arrived in the 1950s and 60s didn't ever have a kind of salary that allowed them to travel a lot, and so there was no instant need to get a British passport. It was just a kind of formality and something that was expensive. And I think what I didn't realise is that actually something like 9 million people in Britain don't have passports. It's kind of, it's not something that everyone has. And a lot of people would ask me, but why didn't they have passports? But actually, not everyone does.
Thank you. That's all making sense. The core of this book is probably the personal stories. It is a story of public policy, but it's much more the story of all these individuals who might have been volunteering in a soup kitchen one time and then ended up with a life turned upside down and having to fall back on that soup kitchen themselves, like as a result of their mistreatment. And because it's personal, because I've been asking policy questions, this I hope isn't self-indulgent, but I just want to tell you a story about something that happened to me when I was young, which I think is an interesting contrast with what happened to these people. Now, my dad, who died when I was 16 and was born in Australia, which he left when he was 2 and never went back to. When I was 19, I applied, we went, my mother and my brother and me, to Australia to see his family. I applied for a visa. I got a word back from the Home Office saying, from someone or other saying, no, because you've been registered as an Australian dual national, you can get an Australian passport instead. And I thought, this is quite funny, having never been to Australia. Got the passport, and very much enjoyed waving at it with a very English accent going through passport control. Then when we came back, my brother, who was in the same situation, had remembered to bring his British passport as well, but I hadn't. And so there I was with an Australian passport and no visa to enter Britain. And I got to the queue and I was like, oh, look, obviously I'm English, I've got this thing, but it's happened because this, you can see my brother's over there. And the woman said, oh, love, I'm sorry, it's a long journey back. I'm going to ask the captain secretary to make you some sandwiches. And then she went, joking, and just let me through. And that's what happened. And it makes you think, my God, this is exactly like some of the stories you've got here, but I'm white.
Yeah.
And it is a story about race.
Yeah. So I think some of the that a lot of people were in exactly your situation. I think there's so many of the stories really upset me that I write about, but one of the worst ones is about a man who had arrived in the UK as a child in the early 1960s, whose children took him on holiday to Jamaica for his 50th birthday, and he hadn't travelled before out of the country. It was quicker and easier to get a Jamaican passport than to go through the whole process of getting a British passport, which is time consuming, requires a very high level of proof, and also is expensive. So he got quickly a Jamaican passport. He went with his children, and a group of 10 of them, I think, went to Jamaica, had a great holiday in an all-inclusive hotel. And then at the end of the week, they came back to Kingston Airport, where everybody apart from this man was able to get on the plane and come home. And he was told that he didn't have a British passport, he didn't have any proof that he was a British citizen, and they wouldn't allow him on the flight, which is like similar to your situation, except that it took him 18 months after that to get to a situation in which he could get legal support in the UK to allow him to come back to the UK, a country that he'd lived in for the past 42 years. And that's one of the cases where there's kind of no doubt that were layers of institutional racism, because he wasn't able to get a hearing in the High Commission, the British High Commission in Kingston. He wasn't able to get through the door to try and talk to somebody to explain this is a stupid problem and fix it for me. He just wasn't allowed in. And I just refused to believe that if it had been me standing on the outside of the British High Commission in Kingston, that I would have been made to wait for 18 months.
I'm sure you wouldn't, and it's one thing that's very good about the book is, you get these phrases like institutional racism, whatever, that often sound a bit vague and what are you talking about? But you really set out how that works when the people who are in the cabinet and running the Home Office don't have people with these stories in their family, when the High Commission's got bollards outside it and no one in Jamaica could ever get in. And it's a sort of story of, and also just the way that Britain relates to those countries would be very different to the way it's related to Australia for reasons that go right back. So I was...
Yes, I think that's right. I think that there are another really telling insight for me into why it was that this problem wasn't picked up, was this whole question about the extent that the care with which policymakers look at impact assessments. And, the civil servants must go through the process of providing these impact assessments. But around this time, David Cameron said that they weren't needed, that it was red tape, and that there were clever people in Whitehall who would be able to anticipate a lot of the problems that these impact assessments were calling up without the need for all of that tedious paperwork. And the problem is that those clever people in Whitehall are a very particular kind of person. And around the same time, again, there was research done into the civil service fast track stream, and it showed that it was kind of overwhelmingly white and Oxbridge. And so the nature of those clever people in Whitehall was very specific, and not likely to be thinking about the significance of some of the decisions that were being made. And I think, again, what's really interesting is that all the way through the reporting of this, as it became clear that the reason why people like Paulette and dozens of other people who I was talking to were having these problems was because of the development of the hostile environment policy that Theresa May announced in 2012 and that the government legislated for in immigration bills of 2014 and 2016. that was at the root of it. And it also became clear eventually that the government had been warned that by introducing these measures, there was a particular cohort of people who were liable to be affected. And in one of these impact assessment statements, there was a warning that it would that these measures requiring people to document their right to be in the UK were likely to adversely affect older people who'd come as children whose paperwork might not be entirely in order. And that warning was ignored.
Unbelievable. I mean, that really is stunning, isn't it? Because if you'd read that carefully, you'd know straight away we were talking potentially about grandparents who'd been there for 50 years. And
yeah. So I don't know quite what the process of ignoring that warning was, but I do know that it was thought about because a colleague of ours wrote an article about the report it was based on in 2012. And as we always have to do before publishing an article, he went to the Home Office for a comment, and the comment essentially said, yes, we've considered this report, but we don't think there's any need to set up a unit to deal with these people, which was a recommendation in the report. So it wasn't as if nobody had been thinking about it.
And of course, the other, and you used the phrase there, hostile environment, that became one of these kind of cliches now called compliant environment or something slightly more sanitised. But it's worth just saying for people here maybe exactly what that hostile environment was, because it was more than just a slogan, wasn't it?
Yeah. So it really developed from a phrase that Theresa May gave in response in an interview. It was to begin with, it seemed almost like quite a throwaway comment. She was tasked really by David Cameron to help with the manifesto commitment to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands. This was something that David Cameron had promised in 2010, that by 2012 the coalition government was making very little progress towards achieving. And the difficult thing about those migration targets is that they are published quarterly, so every 3 months newspapers would remind the government that they had made no progress to reducing net migration to the tens of thousands. So both David Cameron and Theresa May were aware that this was politically problematic for them, particularly at a time when UKIP was going from being a party of, what did he call them, fruitcakes, and I mean, Cameron had dismissed them.
Closet racist fruitcakes and something, yeah.
Yeah. The Cameron was beginning to realise that actually this was a force that needed to be taken seriously. So within the cabinet there was a desire to do something tougher on immigration, and also significantly to be seen to be doing something much tougher. So there were two committees set up. First, it was the Hostile Environment Working Group, where ministers from across government were brought into a weekly or monthly, I'm not sure, meeting to discuss ways in which this notion of a hostile environment could be implemented. And then once the term hostile environment was found to be very unpalatable, particularly
the Lib Dems didn't like
by the Lib Dems, they changed the title of the working group to a kind of rather peculiar acronym, which was called MATBAPS, which was Migrant Access to Benefits and Pensions, or Benefits and I forget what the P.
It doesn't matter really.
But anyway, so the pressure was really on ministers from every department to come up with ideas to introduce border checks in many more kind of scenarios than we were previously used to. So before, we would have border checks at the border, at the ports, at the airports, and people would be checked by professional immigration workers, people who understood exactly what a passport looked like, what a visa looked like, what having leave to remain meant. this was, if you were, you have to remember as well that this was kind of the middle of the era of austerity and cuts to all government departments. So if you're on the one hand trying to reduce net migration, but simultaneously cutting the Home Office's budget, you can't kind of arrest yourself, or arrest your way out of that problem, or deport your way out of that so-called problem. You have to find a different way. And the kind of ingenious way that they came up with was to spread the responsibility to civilians, so that landlords had to check the immigration status of prospective tenants, and if they failed to do that, they faced a fine. Employers, who'd also always had to check the immigration status of future employees, were given a much higher fine for wrongly employing somebody who was here illegally. So I think that fine went from a few £1,000s up to £20,000. And then as the measures got more punitive in 2016, after the coalition had disappeared, there was also a criminal sanction added.
I mean, you had the doctors, didn't you? That was something that really rocketed this up the agenda, wasn't it?
Yeah, and
started refusing.
Medical staff had also to check immigration status, and that really was the moment at which, having felt quite depressed by the failure of this issue that I was writing about on a kind of weekly basis to get any political traction at all. The one story that made people pay attention was the case of a man called, we called him
Albert.
We called him Albert, but that wasn't his real name. His real name is Sylvester Marshall. He was somebody who'd arrived here as a teenager, who'd worked all his life, paid taxes. His mother had brought him here because she came to work in the NHS as a nurse in the London hospital. He developed prostate cancer and was referred by his GP to the Royal Marsden for a course of chemotherapy to deal with the prostate cancer. He arrived to start his first session of radiotherapy, was asked for documentary proof that he was eligible for NHS treatment. And he was unable to provide any because he didn't have a British passport, and he didn't. The national insurance number that he showed them was not considered to be enough. So he was told he either had to come up with £54,000, which he didn't have, or wouldn't be able to have his radiotherapy treatment. So I met him a couple of months after he'd been told that, and I'd almost by that point I was quite optimistic that the idea that once he'd given an interview explaining what his situation was, that the hospital would immediately turn around and go, "We made a really terrible mistake, we're so sorry, let's start your radiotherapy tomorrow." But it didn't happen, and it was a real kind of test case for the hospital and for the NHS about how rigidly they were going to stick to this new requirement to get people to prove that they were eligible for free treatment. And it was incredibly upsetting because here was somebody who knew that he had cancer, who wasn't getting the radiotherapy that his consultant had told him that he needed, and who was waiting for something to happen. And at that point, I think because we really care about the NHS sort of beyond everything else, this suddenly became an issue that was taken up in the Commons, and Jeremy Corbyn raised it with Theresa May at question time. She didn't know anything about it, but it was the first time that it began to get some political traction. But it was really slow. I mean, it was amazing how at The Guardian we were kind of publishing piece after piece after piece, and I kept asking if we could have interviews with the Home Secretary or somebody from the Home Office, and it just wasn't an issue that anyone wanted to engage with.
I mean, I remember personally just like reading that story. I think it was on Saturday morning, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Like, and thinking, my God, and I hadn't registered any of the others before.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of news around, and suddenly that one is like, my God. But the thing that comes through, and time and again in the book, as well as like just people's lives being literally turned upside down by, you know, a situation where, as you put it on the back, in the first sentence, how do you pack for a one-way journey back to a country you left when you were 11 and not visited in half a century? You know, this is like, that's the first thing that hits you. But the next thing, I think, is this, and the case there with the Royal Marsden was a classic of this Kafkaesque kind of bureaucracy where the Home Office is kind of blaming the hospital by going, oh, well, a clinician's got to decide if it's urgent treatment or not. The hospital's kind of blaming the Home Office. The sense of the individual being turned from pillar to post. You know, there's a letter that comes and says, ring the number on the top of this letter if you're not happy with this decision, and there is no phone number on the letter. And the huge thing, and maybe like, you know, the central fact of the scandal, is this punishing insistence on the individual to have a perfect memory and perfect documentation of everything that's happened to them, with the Home Office's own decision a few years before to destroy the only records that existed.
Yeah. So that was, for me, one of the most exciting bits of doing this reporting, that actually, unsurprisingly, was wasn't an amazingly fun bit of work, because it involved so many cases of people's lives being catastrophically ruined. But the only really fun bit was being contacted by a Home Office whistleblower who wanted to talk about his time working in a division of the Croydon processing centre. And he was a relatively junior member of staff who had a very clear memory of the unease that he and colleagues had felt in 2010 when they were told that this archive of registration slips or landing cards was going to be destroyed because, well, there were a number of different reasons given, but at the time it was said that this was because the building, the basement room where they were kept was had to be cleared because the Home Office was moving to a different building. And he remembers very clearly going to his senior manager and saying, you can't do that because we are called on every few weeks by people who are unable to find records of their arrival in the UK, usually people from the Caribbean. We're called on to go into that archive to see whether we can find their landing slip. And if you remove that archive, these people are going to face real problems. He recounts this very uncomfortable conversation he had with a senior official, and how his concerns and the concerns of colleagues were ignored, and the data was destroyed. And then he recounts returning to the same department after a break of a couple of years and seeing the frequency with which people were coming to that department in search of documentary evidence of arrival, seeing that it had risen because by this point the hostile environment policies were in place, and the frustration of people who worked there that they weren't able to just go and get the key and go down to the basement as they had done before and sift through the archives. And this was quite a difficult thing to report on because I wasn't able to see what these cards looked like. I didn't really know how comprehensive they were or how crucial they were to the bigger picture. But I was really helped by a colleague at The Guardian who does investigations as his kind of everyday job, who helped me to write a very detailed question to the Home Office press office, a very detailed letter saying, I've been told this and bullet pointing about 15 facts that this whistleblower had told me, and asked them to respond if anything wasn't correct. And they came back actually with a very detailed response confirming that pretty much everything he'd said was right, and coming up with a different reason for that. They said it was to do with data protection, that the files had been destroyed, or which
maybe it was, but it's still a bit harsh on.
Well, I mean, certainly at the time, the timing of it from the workers, they knew that the building was being cleared, and
right.
But anyway, it was a really helpful response from the Home Office, because there was no denial of what had happened. But yeah, it was just really sad, because it's kind of not the whole story, but it was another really unfortunate Home Office decision that, again, you kind of have to question why they thought those records weren't that important.
And on the politics of this is interesting, because I think this sort of was 2009-10 end of the Labour government, this blanking of the memory.
Yeah. This was a kind of, politically, this was very very difficult for Labour, because they thought that they'd really they thought that they were able to place this decision on Theresa May, but actually it was a decision made under Labour before the 2010 election and implemented by Theresa May's Home Office after the 2010 election. So it was never entirely clear who was to blame. And it's worth saying as well that that it's not totally binary, the responsibility for all of these problems. Under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, we saw a kind of ratcheting up of immigration controls by the Labour Party, and the first mention of the word hostile environment came before 2010 under Labour. And some of the people who I met who were wrongly refused entry back to Britain, this goes back to the Blair era.
And of course, even later, up to 2015, I mean, all the parties are trying to respond to the same political pressure, but we forget now it's only 4 years since, or 5 years since Labour had the mugs saying, tough on immigration, vote Labour. Obviously, I'm saying this in a context where the Corbyn Labour Party has just crashed and burned in spectacular fashion, but was it helpful to you, do you think, that you had as it happened when this story came to light, not a sort of triangulating New Labour type of politician who'd been watching over their shoulder on the immigration question, but Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott, who are both kind of really sort of open borders characters, aren't they?
Well, both Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott were very outspoken on the issue once we collected a critical mass of cases, and David Lammy in particular was extraordinarily powerful in raising the profile of this issue. That some of the people who I interviewed were a bit disappointed that as constituency MPs, Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott and Dawn Butler had been approached by individuals asking for help, and they felt they hadn't been helped enough by them historically, because again that it was quite difficult as an individual MP to see the problems that people like Paulette or Sylvester Marshall were experiencing as systemic problems rather than as individual really complicated cases. And so it was only with a kind of weight of more and more people coming forward.
And once you've joined all the dots, I mean...
And explaining that this was the same really complicated problem, it was only then that Corbyn and the Labour Party really got angry about it. As indeed did a lot of Conservative MPs. It's very interesting to see Jacob Rees-Mogg speaking out about this very loudly. And the moment that, there was a kind of tipping point at which it became impossible for the government to ignore it anymore, which came when the 2018 Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit came to London. and Theresa May, or the Downing Street, made a kind of tactical mistake in deciding to refuse a request from all of the 12 Caribbean leaders for a meeting during that summit to discuss this issue. And they were told that Theresa May didn't have time in her schedule. And I wrote that story and we put that on the front page of The Guardian, and then suddenly the whole issue went from being something that, The Guardian was writing about to top of the news bulletins across...
The BBC and...
Yeah, and picked up internationally. And it was, for me, it was very extraordinary and slightly galling to see the speed with which ministers were suddenly on television, falling over themselves to apologise for the appalling treatment that this group of people had suffered. And yet, 24 hours before, there'd been no recognition from the government that there was anything really worth commenting on.
Now, there's an interesting line in the book from the person who happens to be your brother-in-law, Boris Johnson, where he says, you really fucked up the Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit.
Yeah.
Do you think, do you know how excited or appalled or whatever he is about this story, and whether the change from Theresa May to the new government would make any odds?
I don't know because I don't know because it's that's not the kind of because I don't discuss that kind of thing with him. We did have one conversation a couple of years ago in passing about it, but and as I said to you, it was a real kind of dilemma for me about whether or not to include that in the book that I wrote, because it's a kind of it's a difficult thing to write about yourself, I guess, as a journalist. But because this book is a lot about the process of reporting and the kind of opening up a bit what it's like to be in a newsroom, I thought it might be odd not to not to be kind of open about that. But you don't know. I don't know.
Fair enough. While we're on personalities, you also talk about a meeting with Amber Rudd. If we look back, how would you allocate the blame? And it's between Amber Rudd, say, and Theresa May. Amber Rudd comes across as very sort of, not exactly zealous, but very evasive.
So I think a lot of the people who I spoke to who were really affected by this were quite disappointed when Amber Rudd resigned, because they felt that she had been made to take the rap for this, and that with her resignation, the government was then able to say, look, a head has rolled, we've dealt with this issue, and now we're moving on. And there was quite a kind of clear laying of responsibility, not from me, but from those people affected, at the feet of Theresa May, because this was her. This was really her initiative when she was in the Home Office, and it was something that Amber Rudd had inherited. I suppose I feel that the Home Office under Amber Rudd could have responded much more quickly to the growing pile of evidence that there was a systemic problem, and they didn't respond. And then, of course, the actual kind of practical reason why she resigned was sort of a side issue. She resigned because she erroneously told a select committee that there were no targets for deportation. And in fact, it turned out that there really were targets, and not only were there targets, but she had written a letter to Theresa May explaining that they were meeting those targets, or that she was confident that they would exceed those targets. So it was, she either lied or made a mistake, and so she resigned really on that formality. Although she did tell me when I went to interview her a few months afterwards that she felt that she was probably going to have to resign anyway, because the weight of all of the evidence piling up against the Home Office in terms of the treatment of this growing cohort of people was so great that it was going to be quite hard to continue.
I mean, there is a lot of individual blame to go around. Like, you know, David Cameron comes out very callous, I think, about the effect that some of the hostile environment will be happening. Theresa May obviously completely kind of fixated on her target. But I do wonder, like, given the way you tell this, it's really a story of a kind of machine that's driving. And, like, you know, you could think as well about, say, Jeremy Corbyn. Is he, like, the big story was, you know, is he personally anti-Semitic, or is May, as was said by Anna Salisbury, you know, she's got a personal problem with immigrants at some point. And reading your book, I wonder whether the personal prejudice, everyone's got their personal prejudice, but the personal prejudices are a bit beside the point. What happens here is that you've got a machine that allows discrimination to take place.
I think, I've kind of asked a lot of the people who were affected whether they felt that this was reflection of straightforward racism of the British state. And some people were very unwilling to categorise it like that for complicated reasons that I think I understand. And some people said that it was, but in the end, it's not about whether or not Theresa May is personally racist. It's about whether she's presiding over a kind of whole architecture that has racist or racially discriminatory outcomes, which she clearly was and didn't respond quickly to deal with when they came to the fore. I think that's probably a more helpful way of looking at it. But it's certainly true that that there was so much else going on that made this an even worse problem than it might otherwise have been. So cuts and reforms to the way that the Home Office deals with individuals were really problematic, so that people like this woman Paulette, who was told that she was here illegally, she immediately assumed that all she needed to do was to go to the local reporting Home Office reporting centre in Solihull and tell her caseworker that a mistake had been made. But because there weren't caseworkers that you could actually go and see anymore, because the process of reporting had just become a kind of computerised exercise where you go, you queue up, you kind of hand in a piece of paper and you are ticked off by an administrator, the people who are behind the sheet of perspex aren't able really to record that you've made a complaint or that you're unhappy about your treatment. They're just there to take your name, your date of birth, and to record the fact that you have arrived for an appointment, to show that you're complying with the Home Office regulations. So a kind of shrinking of the system to save money and for greater efficiency made that kind of safety net of common sense disappear in a really dangerous way.
But that bit probably was unintended, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. With the one thing that comes through is you've got this sort of deserving, non-deserving distinction, and you talk towards the end about this chap Colin Smith who's committed a pretty minor crime in Britain and then is living homeless in what he calls a war zone. Yeah,
in Jamaica, in Kingston, yeah.
And you've also got then the note paper from the Home Office saying celebrating the Windrush generation or something.
Yeah.
Well, they're still then saying these were the good immigrants and there's these other immigrants over here who are still going to...
Yeah.
I mean, do you see that as the way things are going to go forward?
Yeah, it's really complicated, and it really echoes a kind of parallel debate that you've written about a lot around the kind of deserving poor and the undeserving poor, and people who should get benefits and people who shouldn't get benefits. There was a recognition that a mistake had been made and there was a kind of rush to apologise because the people who were affected were seen as really the best of immigrants, and the government was at pains to say, you know, the people who arrived from the Caribbean in the wake of the Second World War to help rebuild our country have contributed immensely, and we owe them a lot. And in every kind of statement, official statement that the Home Office would provide for an article, that there was that same phrase repeated about how we owe so much to the people of the Caribbean or Commonwealth who'd come to this country to help rebuild it. And what really was the subtext is that the hostile environment shouldn't have been applied to these good migrants, and there was no reflection on whether or not the hostile environment was a good thing or not a very good thing, or no reflection of whether or not it was a problem that the Home Office wasn't actually really very accurately able to tell who was here legally and who was here illegally. And I think we still haven't had that reflection really on, you know, which hostile environment measures are ones that we want to continue with and ones which we don't want to continue with.
Because most of it's still there, isn't it? Not all of it.
There hasn't really been any discussion about repeal of any of those policies. So in one way, I feel some really, really kind of positive things happened as a result of this reporting, and that since the government apologised, 8,000 people have now got British citizenship or some form of papers who didn't previously have it. And that means that, you know, 8,000 families aren't worried about the potential arrival of immigration enforcement officers. So that's a huge thing. Compensation has been promised, not paid yet, but promised to everybody who was affected. People who were stranded in the Caribbean have been flown back to this country. People have got their jobs back and homes back. So in many ways, I feel really positive about the kind of power of journalism to make, to trigger change. But in many other ways, I think sort of we've had an enormous number of apologies, and actually not that much has changed. The immigration legislation remains the same. The hostile environment has been, as you say, rebranded the compliant environment, but it is still there.
I mean, it's such an appalling way, you know, for all the importance of the journalism you've done, as you acknowledge, it's an appalling way to decide which cases are going to get resolved. And you have this guy, Vernon, who's out there for years and years, I think, battling. His papers are suddenly sorted very quickly. And not only is he whisked back to Britain, but BA first class, he says £2,261 for a ticket.
Yeah.
So there's no expenses spared.
Well, there's no expenses spared when the Home Office was aware that his case was about to be written about.
Yeah.
But other people who were flown back from the Caribbean didn't go first class. I mean, it's just amazing.
So it's so arbitrary. And before I bring people in, the final thing I wanted to ask you about was you've still got this hostile environment. You've talked about this as the, you know, in the 60s and 70s, this kind of freedom of movement, if you like, through the empire, the colonies coming to an end. We're leaving the EU this week. Another system of freedom of movement's going to come to an end, and there's a system where they're saying it's all going to be fine and people are going to be able to register and it's all going to work. How worried are you about a Windrush 2.0 affecting people from European countries?
Quite worried. I mean, I don't want to be hysterical about it, because I think it's not helpful when there is when the idea that the British government is going to be deporting large numbers of EU citizens, when that idea gets hold, I just think that that's not helpful. And we've had confirmation this week that there won't be deportations of EU citizens. But at the same time, I am conscious that with 3.4 million or 3.6 million people who've got to go through this process, there has to be an implausibly high success rate for it actually to be a success. So you could have a kind of 95% success rate of people applying for settled status and being given it without any problem. You still have then 5%, and 5% of 3.5 million is, I can't remember how much, but 160,000 people. Is that right?
Sounds like
a lot.
Right.
Even if the system works incredibly well, by the cut-off point of the 31st of June 2021, a large number of people will, for whatever complicated reason, not have secured settled status, and that will be problematic. And I think a lot of good lessons have been learnt by the Home Office as a result of Windrush, and I think there are reasons to feel that they are bending over backwards to be accommodating. So the fee that was there for EU citizens to get the settled status, that's been dropped. The requirement that Windrush people had to provide documentary evidence proving that they had lived in this country for 40 years or for every year going back to 1973, that's been dropped, and the Home Office has taken the onus on the individual to prove it and taken some of that responsibility back on themselves, and they've said that they will go out of their way to check national insurance figures, national tax records, so they're doing a lot of checks and a lot of the work for you. So for 75% of people, I think it's going to be very, very straightforward, and that's what the current figures are showing. The question is what happens to the other 25% of people for whom things are more complicated.
Oh dear, is what I would say listening to that. Let's does anyone want to ask Amelia a question? Yeah, okay, we'll take one at the front here first.
Thank you very much. An extraordinary tale of bureaucratic and political incompetence. I wondered, is there any time that you can actually pinpoint where the rot, for want of a better expression, started? Because you did mention that there were a few problems in the last years of the Labour government. It wasn't just purely and simply what happened under the coalition. Couple of other quick points. First of all, is it possible to give a fairly precise figure of the people who have been affected one way or the other, deported, denied NHS treatment, whatever?
Yeah.
And lastly, coming back to the very point that you were just making, I mean, EU citizens, to what extent? I believe there are at least 3 million in this country. To what extent have they reason, given what we've been talking about, to be apprehensive, to put it mildly?
So the moment and the number affected.
So the history goes back to really 1952 when the legislation begins to get tightened. So you can kind of go back really as far as you like, but it's certainly the case that people who left the UK to travel or to spend some time outside of this country began to have problems in the 1990s when they tried to come back, and the fact that wasn't really ever highlighted as a problem that needed to be fixed or as a scandal is kind of interesting in terms of what issues newspapers or politicians get concerned by, because that was happening a lot and it was ruining people's lives back for decades. But the real escalation of this as a problem was when all of those internal checks began to be introduced from 2012 onwards, when many more people began to be affected when they were trying to get a new job, trying to get healthcare benefits, housing, or to travel. In terms of the numbers of people affected, it's really, really difficult. So we know, because the government has internally set a team of people within the Home Office to go through all of the detention and deportation files. And the way that they've done that has been very limited. They've only looked at people who came from the Caribbean who were detained or wrongly deported, and they are excluding from the numbers that they've counted anybody who's got a criminal record of any kind, regardless of how serious or not it is. So people who have historically committed some kind of crime, an insignificant crime, they're not included in those numbers. So the numbers of people who were wrongly deported or detained is something like 180 people from the Caribbean. The Home Office is saying it will cost too much to extend that bit of investigation to other countries, India, Pakistan, and
So there could be more.
there will be more. There will be a lot more, and we know of a lot more people who were wrongly deported, but who had some kind of criminal record. So the government isn't counting them.
And there'd be a lot of people, weren't there, who, for example, lost the job and then decided to go very quiet, or like you do.
So
never detained.
so the bigger numbers will be people who were refused pensions, were lost housing, refused NHS treatment, or lost their jobs. There will be many, many more of them, but there is no way of counting them. So the only way that we'll know is when we finally get the figures for people who apply for compensation. That will give an indication. Or perhaps when the internal report that the Home Office has commissioned and which has been written is published, but it hasn't been published, even though I think it was more or less ready and leaked in the summer.
We've got a question here. Come forward.
Hi, Amelia. Thank you very much for your book, which has been very enlightening. I'm a researcher who's looking into the hostile environment and also following up with some of the Windrush community, as you say, many of whom have not applied because the process is actually very complex and difficult as well.
Not applied for compensation.
Yeah, which is another issue. I mean, obviously they're being encouraged to do so, but it's not. A lot of them are finding it very difficult, and there's very little support for people who are being encouraged to apply for that compensation process. But in terms of the kind of good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative, which you mentioned, and this is sort of talking about other people, I'm wondering, I mean, the thing about Windrush, which in one sense, and I'm not to diminish it in any way, but it was an amazing story because of the imagery of people coming here on boats, being offered, essentially being told they're British and then being told that they weren't.
Yeah.
And that's a very unique story. Obviously, there are also lots of other immigrants, as you mentioned, who came from different places and who keep coming and who have come and who are contributing to this country. And I just wonder you couldn't report on everything, you couldn't look at every single case, but you must have heard or come across many from all over the world. And how, you said you're not sure much has changed within the government. We're talking about EU citizens at the moment for obvious reasons, but what about non-EU citizens? Do you think there's work being done to look into the investigations of those people who've either been wrongly deported, detained, or served, or refused jobs or healthcare, whatever? Is there kind of, amongst you and your colleagues, an appetite for that going forward? Because I worry that will get lost in all the Brexit talk and so on, even though that's obviously important as well.
It already has got lost, not so much at our end, although probably, but I think I felt quite heartened by some of Sajid Javid's responses when he was Home Secretary, and he said that he wanted to implement a reform of the immigration system and to make it a more compassionate system, and he wanted the Home Office to become a fairer place. And we can feel as cynical as we like about those comments, but it's nevertheless significant that he thought it necessary to promise that kind of reform, and that he wanted compassion to be injected into the system. And so I suppose for a while I felt that was something, positive and something that we could hold him to. We've got a new Home Secretary who has again apologised to the people affected by the Windrush situation, but hasn't done very much to make things easier in terms of the compensation process. And as you say, one of the reasons why it's so complicated for people to apply for this compensation is that they are again required to submit extraordinary numbers of detailed bits of documentation proving that they were affected in the way that they say that they were. And that, that probably is something that they can do with the support of a well-informed advisor. But again, there's no legal aid assigned to this, and lawyers aren't able to apply for kind of exceptional legal aid. So it's really, really complicated. On the kind of wider picture of non-Windrush people who are affected by hostile environment policies, I think that is a really, really difficult and important area. And that's partly what I was trying to say when I kind of said that the branding of Windrush as an issue was incredibly helpful to begin with, to help people understand that this was a group of people who were affected. But ultimately, it's been very unhelpful because the government can say this treatment of people affected by the Windrush issue was a mistake, and we've dealt with it and we've apologised for it, without really needing to have to reflect on the bigger issue. And that bigger issue is partly around the many other categories of people, of migrants who are here entirely legally, but who aren't, for whatever complicated reason, able to demonstrate that they're here legally. And in that category are people who don't have the money to apply for the naturalisation or citizenship that they're required to apply for because it's become very expensive, or they're people who have been whose records have been lost by the Home Office, or they're people who are in the process of applying for it, whose status is very unclear, or they're the children of people who don't have clear settled status, whose own status isn't secure. So there are many other groups of people who are also wrongly subject to the hostile environment. And then there's a whole separate debate about the people who are, according to the letter of the law, rightly being exposed to the hostile environment, and whether or not that is something that we really want to see. Because the whole point about the hostile environment is to make life hostile, and that will make people homeless. That will make people unable to get the sort of support which is essential to live on. And even when I talked to Amber Rudd about this, I think that she didn't really seem to have, didn't want to recognise that actually if you're exposing people to a hostile environment and as a result of that they become homeless, she was saying, well, there'll be safety nets for those people. But actually, there are no safety nets for those people. And that is the very point of the whole system.
And it's not just compassion, is it? It's also just that culture that runs through the way that the Home Office has handled immigration for years, which is not balance of probabilities, but systematic disbelief, refuse first and take the appeal later. We've got one more here at the front. And in a minute, I think we'll wrap up, but we can go upstairs and continue the conversation with a drink.
Hi, and also thank you for writing a really brilliant book, I'm sure. My name's Georgia. I used to work for Migrants' Rights Network, and something that really shocked me that I came across was that there are in fact some EU citizens who have been deported via administrative removals. Many of those people who are homeless and vulnerable and have been sent back for failing to meet their treaty rights. So like the majority of people have been sent to Romania, for example, where obviously winters are devastating, and if they're homeless there, they're much more likely to...
So you mean, but it would be wrong to be reassured by this reassurance
Yeah,
that people won't be deported.
I suppose
I
so.
think that's an important point.
Yeah, and when, you know, with the economy becoming, with it's a tough place right now, and with Brexit around the corner, I was just wondering whether you were aware of that or plan to report on it at all. And the second question really is, I suppose, do you see any sort of political moments